In a storage cabinet sealed since 1907, renovators found something that shouldn't exist. Breeding logs, surgical records, photographs of children organized by inherited traits, all kept by a circus owner who treated human beings like farm animals being bred for specific characteristics. Before we dive into the story, what's the darkest case you've ever heard or experienced? Write it in the comments. Let's compare notes. Also, tell us where you're watching from today and what time is it right now. We're building a community of truth seekers who aren't afraid of the dark. Now, let's continue with the story. The discovery happened during what should have been routine renovation work. In March of 1998, contractors tearing down the interior walls of a former warehouse in Columbus, Indiana, found a locked medical cabinet hidden inside a false wall. The building had been used as winter storage for Gentry's traveling curiosities from 1887 through 1907, then stood empty for decades before being converted to storage space in the 1930s. The cabinet itself measured 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide, made from heavy oak with a brass lock that had rusted over 9 decades of being hidden. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect against moisture, sat 17 leather-bound record books, 4 photo albums, and a metal box containing medical tools that belonged in an operating room, not a circus office. The record books documented something never before seen in the history of American entertainment. Virgil Gentry, owner of one of the Midwest's most successful traveling shows, had kept detailed breeding records on his performers. Each entry included physical measurements, family medical histories, documented genetic traits, and what Gentry called hereditary potential assessments. The entries read like farm animal breeding journals, with human beings listed and evaluated for their reproductive usefulness to his business. One record book labeled Matrimonial Arrangements and Progeny Outcomes detailed marriages Gentry had arranged between performers based on their physical characteristics. Another marked Medical Interventions and Developmental Tracking contained surgical notes describing procedures performed on pregnant performers, attempts to influence fetal development through diet manipulation, and hormone treatments given without consent or medical justification. The photo albums revealed how systematic Gentry's project was. Children were photographed at regular intervals, arranged by family group, with handwritten notes indicating which physical traits had successfully passed down and which had not. Some photographs showed the same child at different ages. Others appeared only once with mysterious notes like removed from program or transferred to institutional care. The Columbus Historical Society immediately contacted state authorities. What began as an architectural discovery became a criminal investigation into crimes committed nearly a century earlier. Researchers spent 18 months cataloging the documents, comparing them with census records, marriage certificates, and institutional admission logs. What emerged was a portrait of abuse so systematic, so carefully documented, that it challenged assumptions about how thoroughly such mistreatment could be hidden within legitimate business operations. Gentry had operated his breeding program for at least 20 years, involving dozens of performers and producing at least 43 documented children, all while running a successful public entertainment business that newspapers praised for its humane treatment of performers. The question that haunted investigators wasn't just what Gentry had done. It was how he convinced an entire community, including medical professionals and local authorities, that his operations were not only acceptable, but progressive and enlightened. Virgil Gentry purchased his first traveling show in 1883 with money inherited from his father's Chicago meatpacking operation. He was 27 years old, college-educated at Northwestern University, and had spent 2 years working in his father's business, learning inventory management, selective breeding of livestock, and the economics of turning things into commodities. He applied these lessons to human entertainment with chilling precision. Gentry's Traveling Curiosities launched its first season with 12 performers and covered a route through Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio. By 1886, the operation had expanded to include 23 performers, 6 support staff, and 3 customized railway cars for transport. Unlike competing shows that moved constantly, Gentry established a permanent winter headquarters in Columbus, Indiana, a decision that newspaper accounts praised as progressive concern for performer welfare. The Columbus facility occupied 4 acres on the eastern edge of town, far enough from residential areas to avoid complaints, but close enough to rail lines for efficient transport. Gentry built a main performance hall for rehearsals, 3 residential buildings for performers, a medical facility claimed was for their healthcare needs, and administrative offices where he kept his records. Local residents viewed the compound as evidence of Gentry's enlightened management. They had no access to what happened inside. By 1890, Gentry employed 32 performers representing what period terminology classified as physical curiosities. His recruitment practices followed a specific pattern. He targeted individuals living in state institutions or poorhouses, offering them contracts that promised steady employment, housing, and medical care. For people facing lifelong institutionalization or poverty, his offers seemed generous. The contracts they signed, however, contained provisions that gave Gentry extraordinary control over their lives. One provision named Gentry as medical guardian, giving him authority to consent to any treatment or procedure his hired physicians recommended. Another required performers to live at the winter headquarters between touring seasons, effectively isolating them from outside contacts for months each year. A third clause gave Gentry authority over performer marriages, justified in contract language as protecting the show's reputation and ensuring stable personal circumstances. These provisions appeared nowhere in contracts offered to support staff, musicians, or other employees. Only performers with physical differences signed documents surrendering this level of personal freedom. Gentry's business model proved remarkably profitable. While competitors struggled with the logistics of constant travel and performer turnover, his permanent facility reduced operating costs and allowed year-round control of his primary assets. Financial records from the Columbus County Archives show Gentry's operation earning between $40,000 and $60,000 annually by the mid-1890s, exceptional revenue for a regional entertainment business. He reinvested these profits not in improved performer living conditions, but in expanding his medical facilities. Between 1893 and 1895, Gentry added a second building to the Columbus compound specifically designated for what he termed health optimization and genetic documentation. This facility contained examination rooms, a surgical theater, a medical photography studio, and residential quarters where performers could be isolated during medical procedures or pregnancy. The compound became a closed world with its own rules, its own hierarchy, and its own definition of acceptable treatment. Local authorities never questioned what happened inside. Gentry made strategic donations to city development projects, employed local contractors for maintenance work, and cultivated relationships with Columbus business leaders who viewed him as a successful entrepreneur bringing prestige to their community. Behind the facade of progressive employment practices, Gentry was constructing something else entirely, a laboratory where human reproduction could be manipulated, documented, and exploited for commercial profit. The medical record books recovered in 1998 contained entries that read like veterinary breeding records, not healthcare documentation. Each performer had a file tracking menstrual cycles, physical measurements updated monthly, dietary intake calculated by caloric value, and notes on family medical histories extending back 3 generations when available. Gentry wasn't providing healthcare. He was monitoring biological inventory. Mandatory medical examinations began in 1895, instituted under the stated purpose of preventing disease outbreaks within the close quarters of touring life. Performers underwent these examinations weekly during winter months, bi-weekly during touring season. The examinations were conducted by whatever physician Gentry currently employed, and performers had no right to refuse them. Contract provisions classified refusal as breach of employment, punishable by immediate termination and loss of all compensation. For people who had signed away medical guardianship and had nowhere else to go, termination meant probable institutionalization in state asylums. Gentry made certain his performers understood this reality. Multiple record book entries noted performers who had initially resisted examinations being taken on supervised visits to the Indiana State Hospital for the Insane in Indianapolis. These visits served as warnings: comply with the program or face the alternative. The examinations went far beyond legitimate medical assessment. Female performers underwent internal examinations regardless of symptoms or complaints. Gentry's physicians documented ovulation patterns, assessed what they termed reproductive viability, and made recommendations about which women were suitable for his matrimonial program. Male performers were evaluated for what record book entries described as genetic contribution potential, based on pseudoscientific assessments of their physical traits and family histories. By 1896, Gentry had hired Dr. Edmund Fairchild as his permanent staff physician. Fairchild had been fired from Indianapolis General Hospital 2 years earlier following allegations of unauthorized experimental procedures on charity patients. Hospital administrators had quietly terminated him rather than risk public scandal, and Fairchild disappeared from legitimate medical practice until Gentry found him. Fairchild's personal journals, discovered with the other documents, revealed a man who viewed ethical constraints as obstacles to scientific progress. He wrote extensively about his theories of hereditary trait manipulation, believing that careful environmental control during pregnancy could enhance or suppress specific physical characteristics. Gentry's compound gave him unrestricted access to human subjects and complete freedom from medical oversight. The isolation of the winter headquarters served multiple purposes. Performers had no contact with outside physicians who might question the treatments they received. Mail was monitored and often intercepted. Visitors required Gentry's explicit permission and were never allowed into residential or medical buildings. Even during touring season, performers were prohibited from seeking outside medical care without written authorization from Fairchild. Gentry justified these restrictions as necessary protection. He told performers that outside physicians didn't understand their unique medical needs, that the general public couldn't be trusted with knowledge of their conditions, that only within his care could they live safely. Some performers, especially those who had experienced genuine abuse in institutions before joining the show, initially believed him. The living arrangements reinforced this isolation. Residential buildings were separated by gender except for married couples who received private rooms. These accommodations seemed generous compared to institutional dormitories, but they served a controlling function. Gentry decided who married whom, when couples could live together, and when they would be separated. Housing wasn't a benefit, it was leverage. Meals were communal and prepared by staff Gentry employed. This allowed dietary control that Fairchild considered essential to his experiments. Pregnant performers received special meal plans designed to influence fetal development according to theories Fairchild had developed, but never tested in legitimate research settings. Some of these diets were nutritionally deficient. Others included substances Fairchild believed would enhance specific hereditary traits. No performer could leave the compound without permission and escort. Gentry claimed this protected them from public harassment, but it functioned as imprisonment. The walls weren't physical, they were economic, legal, and psychological, and they were absolute. The record book labeled Matrimonial Arrangements and Progeny Outcomes documented 14 marriages arranged between 1896 and 1902. None resulted from courtship. All followed Gentry's careful calculations about which physical traits might successfully pass to offspring. His approach mimicked agricultural breeding practices his father had used with prize cattle. Gentry identified performers whose physical characteristics he considered commercially valuable, then selected partners based on family medical histories that suggested strong hereditary transmission. He arranged introductions, encouraged relationships with strategic housing assignments and work partnerships, and applied pressure when couples resisted formalizing unions he had predetermined. The first arranged marriage took place in January of 1896. Gentry paired Clara Finch, a 21-year-old woman with achondroplasia, with Thomas Brenneman, a 24-year-old man with the same condition. Both had family histories showing the trait passed reliably to children. Gentry's notes indicated he expected their offspring would be commercially viable within 4 years of birth, treating the anticipated child as future inventory before conception occurred. Clara and Thomas had never expressed romantic interest in each other. Record book entries show Gentry called them to separate meetings where he explained that marriage would provide them better housing, increased compensation, and improved security. He implied their contracts might not be renewed otherwise. They married 3 weeks later in a civil ceremony Gentry arranged and witnessed. The pattern repeated with calculated regularity. Gentry identified compatible pairs based on genetics, not affection. He reassigned living quarters to place chosen couples in proximity. He adjusted work schedules to force interaction. He offered financial incentives for marriage and implied professional consequences for refusal. Some performers genuinely developed affection for partners Gentry selected. Others simply complied because resistance seemed futile. By 1898, 7 couples lived in the married performer housing. Gentry monitored their reproductive activity with invasive precision. Fairchild tracked each wife's menstrual cycles and conducted examinations to confirm ovulation patterns. When pregnancies didn't occur within expected timeframes, Fairchild intervened with fertility treatments that ranged from herbal supplements to more aggressive pharmaceutical interventions he had developed through experimentation. When couples did produce children, Gentry evaluated the offspring with cold commercial assessment. Record book entries noted which hereditary traits successfully transmitted and which did not. Children who inherited commercially valuable characteristics received notations like suitable for future development or exceeds anticipated potential. Those who didn't faced bleaker assessments. One entry from August of 1899 documented the birth of a son to performers Margaret and Daniel Ashford, both of whom had exhibited syndactyly. The child was born without the condition. Gentry's notation reads simply, offspring genetically unremarkable, no commercial application. Consider alternative placement. What alternative placement meant became clear through cross-referencing with institutional admission records. Between 1897 and 1903, at least 6 children born to performers at the Columbus compound were transferred to state care facilities. Official records listed them as abandoned or surrendered by parents unable to provide care. The reality was that Gentry had deemed them commercially worthless and removed them from the program. Couples who produced children meeting Gentry standards faced different challenges. They maintained custody but understood strict conditions. Children remained at the compound year-round even during touring season. Gentry controlled their education, healthcare, and social development. Parents had limited authority over their own children's welfare. When marriages failed to produce desired results within 3 years, Gentry dissolved them with the same calculated efficiency he had used to arrange them. He separated couples, reassigned housing, and arranged new pairings. Divorce wasn't legally necessary since he controlled every aspect of their lives regardless of marital status. He simply moved people like chess pieces, pursuing genetic combinations that might yield profitable offspring. The emotional devastation of these forced separations went unrecorded in Gentry's record books. He documented only biological outcomes and commercial projections. The human cost of treating people as breeding stock didn't factor into his calculations. Edmund Fairchild kept a separate set of journals documenting procedures he knew no legitimate medical institution would approve. These journals, written in technical medical terminology that couldn't disguise their horror, revealed experimentation that treated pregnancy as an opportunity for genetic manipulation rather than a natural process requiring careful monitoring. Fairchild believed hereditary traits could be enhanced or suppressed through intervention during fetal development. His theories had no scientific foundation, but Gentry's compound gave him what he had never possessed in legitimate practice: subjects who couldn't refuse and complete freedom from oversight. His first documented experimental intervention occurred in March of 1897 on a performer named Catherine Drummond, pregnant with her first child. Fairchild administered a compound he had formulated combining ergot extracts, mercury derivatives, and substances he listed only by coded abbreviations. His journal entry explained he believed this mixture would intensify hereditary trait expression during critical developmental windows. Catherine delivered a stillborn child in November. Fairchild's notation attributed the death to subject's underlying constitutional weakness rather than his intervention. He made no record of informing Catherine what he had administered or acknowledging that his experimental compound might have caused the death. 3 months later, he used a modified version of the same formula on another pregnant performer. The surgical theatre Gentry had constructed in 1895 gave Fairchild tools for more invasive interventions. He performed procedures he claimed would optimize fetal positioning or enhance nutrient delivery, operations that legitimate obstetricians would have recognized as unnecessary and dangerous. Several of these procedures resulted in severe infections. At least 2 caused hemorrhaging that required emergency intervention to prevent death. Fairchild documented these complications with clinical detachment, treating them as data points rather than human suffering. When infections occurred, he noted the symptoms and treatments but never questioned whether his procedures had caused the problems. When women died, he attributed their deaths to pre-existing conditions or poor constitution, never to his experimental interventions. His obsession with hereditary manipulation extended beyond pregnancy. Fairchild subjected children born in the compound to regular examinations that went far beyond standard pediatric care. He measured their growth patterns against predictions he had made based on parental traits. When children developed differently than his theories predicted, he adjusted their diets, administered experimental supplements, and in some cases recommended surgical interventions to correct developmental deviations. One particularly disturbing journal entry from June of 1900 described a procedure Fairchild performed on a 3-year-old boy whose limb development didn't match the dwarfism exhibited by both parents. Fairchild attempted to induce corrective growth restriction through a combination of dietary manipulation and application of restrictive bracing he had designed. The child developed severe malnutrition and chronic pain. Fairchild recorded these outcomes as unexpected complications requiring program adjustment. Gentry funded all of Fairchild's work without question. Supply ledgers showed regular purchases of pharmaceutical compounds, surgical equipment, and specialized dietary supplements that had no legitimate medical application. Fairchild ordered substances from chemical supply companies, sometimes using false documentation about their intended use. No regulatory authority monitored these purchases or questioned why a circus physician required access to experimental compounds. The relationship between Gentry and Fairchild functioned as a perfect partnership in exploitation. Gentry provided subjects funding and protection from oversight. Fairchild provided pseudoscientific justification for treating human beings as experimental material. Neither man acknowledged moral boundaries or considered the humanity of the people they controlled. Fairchild's journals revealed his awareness that his methods violated medical ethic. Several entries included defensive justifications, arguing that advancement of knowledge required sacrifice, that his subjects received better care than they would in institutions, that future generations would vindicate his work. These rationalizations couldn't disguise what his records documented: systematic experimentation on captive subjects who had no ability to consent and no protection from abuse. Between 1897 and 1906, Fairchild conducted documented experimental interventions on at least 19 pregnant women and 12 children. The true number was likely higher, as some procedures may have gone unrecorded or been described in journals that were destroyed before the 1998 discovery. The building Gentry designated as the nursery was constructed in 1898, strategically positioned at the rear of the compound away from public view. It housed children born to performers, separating them from their parents for what Gentry claimed were developmental and educational purposes. The true function was assessment and conditioning of future attractions. Children lived under constant evaluation. Fairchild examined them monthly, documenting physical development with measurements, photographs, and detailed written observations. These examinations weren't medical checkups. They were commercial appraisals determining which children possessed traits valuable enough to justify continued investment in their care. The nursery operated with rigid scheduling that controlled every aspect of childhood. Wake times, meal times, educational activities, and recreational periods followed precise timetables designed to maximize what Gentry termed developmental efficiency. Children saw their parents during supervised weekly visits lasting exactly 1 hour. These restrictions were justified as necessary for proper socialization and education, but they served to reinforce Gentry's absolute control over the next generation. Educational instruction focused on performance skills rather than standard academics. Children learned stagecraft, public speaking for exhibition purposes, and how to present themselves to audiences. Those showing promise received additional training. Those who didn't faced uncertain futures that Gentry's record books documented with chilling brevity. A photographic album recovered in 1998 contained images of 17 children arranged in rows by age group. Each photograph included a card with the child's name, birth date, parentage, and a numerical rating system Gentry had developed. Ratings ranged from 1 to 5, assessing what he called exhibition potential. Children rated 4 or 5 received notations like suitable for future program development. Those rated 1 or 2 had notations that were far more ominous. Cross-referencing these photographs with institutional admission records revealed a pattern of disposal. Children deemed commercially unviable disappeared from nursery records within months of low ratings. State institution logs showed corresponding admissions of children matching their descriptions, listed as abandoned by unknown parents or surrendered by guardians claiming inability to provide care. Gentry had developed relationships with administrators at several Indiana institutions. Correspondence found in his business files showed he made regular donations to these facilities. In exchange, administrators accepted children he transferred without asking uncomfortable questions about their origins or the circumstances of their surrender. The system functioned smoothly because everyone involved benefited except the children. One letter dated September of 1901, written by Gentry to the superintendent of the Indiana State School for Feeble-Minded Youth, discussed the transfer of a 4-year-old boy. Gentry described the child as born to employees no longer in my service, and explained he could not maintain responsibility for the boy's care. The letter included a donation of $200. The superintendent's response confirmed admission and thanked Gentry for his continued generosity to the institution. The boy's actual parents were still performing with Gentry's show when this transfer occurred. They had no say in the decision. Their son had failed to inherit the physical traits Gentry had anticipated, making him worthless to the breeding program. Gentry simply removed him, and the parents had no legal recourse to prevent it. Their contracts had granted him guardianship authority that superseded their parental rights. Children who remained in the nursery faced different but equally troubling futures. They were being groomed as performing assets, raised with the understanding that their value lay entirely in their commercial potential. Some were as young as 3 when they began stage training. By age 6, those rated highly were performing in exhibitions. Their childhoods turned into commodities before they understood what was being taken from them. The nursery's daily logs, maintained by staff Gentry hired to supervise the children, recorded discipline methods that would be recognized today as systematic psychological abuse. Children who resisted training faced isolation, food restriction, and threats of transfer to institutions. The logs documented these punishments matter of factly, treating child compliance as a management issue rather than a human rights violation. Between 1898 and 1906, at least 23 children lived in the nursery at various times. Only 9 remained there when the program ended. Gentry's control extended beyond medical guardianship and housing arrangements into every facet of performer existence. He had constructed a closed system where resistance meant destruction and compliance meant survival under conditions that stripped away human dignity while maintaining the appearance of benevolent employment. Financial dependency formed the foundation of this control. Performers received compensation, but Gentry controlled how and when they accessed their own earnings. He established a company account system where wages were deposited into ledgers he maintained rather than paid directly. Performers could request withdrawals for approved purchases, but Gentry reviewed and authorized every transaction. The system prevented anyone from accumulating enough money to leave independently. Record book entries showed performers requesting funds for basic necessities like clothing or personal items. Many requests were denied with notations explaining the expense was unnecessary or excessive. Even small purchases required written justification. This wasn't financial management. It was economic imprisonment disguised as fiscal responsibility. The isolation of the Columbus compound served multiple control functions beyond preventing outside medical intervention. All mail entering or leaving the facility passed through Gentry's office. He opened and read every letter, censoring or destroying correspondence he deemed problematic. Several performers had family members who sent letters that never reached their intended recipients. Gentry kept these intercepted letters in a separate file, documented proof of his systematic prevention of outside contact. When performers did receive approved correspondence, Gentry monitored their responses. Outgoing letters had to be left unsealed for his review before mailing. Any attempt to communicate information about conditions at the compound resulted in the letter being destroyed and the writer facing disciplinary consequences. This surveillance ensured that family members and former associates received only carefully managed information suggesting performers were content and well treated. Visitors required written permission submitted at least 1 week in advance. Gentry granted these requests rarely and only after investigating the visitor's identity and relationship to the performer. When visits were allowed, they occurred in designated areas with staff present. Private conversations were impossible. Most performers stopped requesting visits after repeated denials or the humiliation of supervised meetings where genuine communication couldn't occur. The threat of institutionalization functioned as Gentry's ultimate weapon. He made certain performers understood their alternatives to compliance. Periodic supervised trips to state asylums served as vivid demonstrations of what awaited those who challenged his authority. These visits, supposedly for medical consultations with institutional physicians, actually functioned as psychological torture, showing performers the fate they would face if deemed unfit for his program. Gentry cultivated relationships with asylum administrators and local law enforcement that gave him power to institutionalize performers who resisted. Several record book entries documented his threats to have uncooperative individuals committed using Indiana's broad laws, allowing institutionalization of anyone deemed unable to care for themselves. For performers with physical differences, these laws could be weaponized easily. Society already viewed them as dependent and incapable. One complaint from Gentry to the right official could result in permanent confinement. 3 performers who tried to leave between 1896 and 1903 were forcibly returned and confined to locked rooms in the medical building for periods ranging from 2 weeks to 3 months. Gentry documented these confinements as necessary medical isolation due to mental instability. Fairchild provided supporting documentation diagnosing these individuals with conditions that justified their imprisonment. No outside physician ever examined them. No legal proceeding reviewed their confinement. Gentry's authority was absolute. The psychological impact of this total control manifested in ways Gentry's record books never acknowledged. Some performers develop what historical psychiatrists would later recognize as learned helplessness, ceasing to resist or question conditions because resistance had proven consistently futile. Others experience complete psychological breaks, documented only through Fairchild's clinical notes about treating hysteria and melancholia with sedatives and isolation. Gentry had created a population of people who existed in legal limbo. They weren't slaves under law, but they possessed no practical freedom. They weren't prisoners officially, but they couldn't leave. They weren't legally incompetent, but they had no control over their own medical care, finances, or personal relationships. He had found the precise gaps in legal protection that allowed him to treat human beings as property, while maintaining the fiction of legitimate employment. Fairchild's medical journals documented deaths with the same clinical detachment he applied to successful procedures. Between 1897 and 1906, at least 11 people died under circumstances directly connected to the breeding program. The actual number was likely higher, as some deaths may have been recorded in documents destroyed before the 1998 discovery. 3 women died from infections following surgical procedures Fairchild performed during pregnancy. The first death occurred in November of 1898. Alice Hartwell, a 23-year-old performer pregnant with her first child, underwent what Fairchild described as a corrective positioning procedure, intended to optimize fetal development. She developed fever within 2 days. Fairchild treated the infection with remedies he had formulated himself rather than seeking outside medical assistance. Alice died 6 days after the procedure. Fairchild's journal entry attributed her death to subject's compromised constitution and inability to withstand standard surgical intervention. He made no acknowledgement that the procedure itself might have been unnecessary or that his inadequate sterile technique had caused the fatal infection. 3 weeks later, he performed a similar procedure on another pregnant performer. The second death from surgical infection came in March of 1899. Sarah Brenneman, wife of Thomas Brenneman from the first arranged marriage, died following complications from a procedure Fairchild performed in her 7th month of pregnancy. Her death left Thomas widowed with a 2-year-old son. Gentry's response was documented in a letter to Thomas explaining that Sarah's death, while tragic, demonstrated the importance of careful genetic selection. Within 6 months, Gentry had arranged Thomas's remarriage to another performer. The third death occurred in August of 1901 under circumstances that Fairchild's records barely acknowledged. Emma Garfield died 2 weeks after delivering a stillborn child. Medical notations indicated she had received repeated injections of a compound Fairchild had been experimenting with, intended to enhance hereditary trait expression during final developmental stages. The stillbirth was followed by severe hemorrhaging that Fairchild couldn't control. His journal entry concluded that Emma had underlying bleeding disorders incompatible with experimental protocols. 4 performers died from what Fairchild classified as suicide, though the circumstances suggested these deaths resulted from the unbearable psychological trauma of the breeding program. In October of 1899, Margaret Ashford, whose son had been removed and institutionalized months earlier, was found dead in her room from an overdose of laudanum. Fairchild had been prescribing laudanum to treat what he diagnosed as melancholia following her son's removal. His records showed increasing dosages over several months. Whether Margaret intentionally overdosed or whether the accumulation of prescribed medication caused her death remained unclear. 2 other women died under similar circumstances involving sedatives Fairchild had prescribed for diagnosed mental distress. A 4th performer, Daniel Kessler, hanged himself in January of 1903 after Gentry dissolved his marriage and reassigned his wife to a new partner. The incident report Gentry filed with local authorities attributed Daniel's death to pre-existing mental instability, making no mention of the forced separation that preceded his suicide by less than 2 weeks. The remaining deaths included complications from childbirth that might have been prevented with proper medical care, and one case where a performer died from what appeared to be malnutrition despite adequate food being available. Fairchild's examination notes on this individual showed he had placed her on a severely restricted diet as part of what he termed a constitutional strengthening protocol. The diet continued even as she exhibited clear signs of starvation. She died weighing 73 pounds. None of these deaths triggered outside investigation. Gentry had cultivated sufficient relationships with local authorities that death certificates were issued without question. Fairchild, as the attending physician, provided cause of death determinations that emphasized natural causes or pre-existing conditions. Bodies were buried in the Columbus City Cemetery with minimal ceremony. Families, when they existed and could be contacted, received brief notifications and modest financial settlements in exchange for signed releases absolving Gentry of liability. The record books recorded these deaths as operational losses, notations about program interruptions and genetic line discontinuation. Gentry calculated the financial impact of each death in terms of lost revenue potential and replacement recruitment costs. The human tragedy, the suffering that preceded these deaths, the families destroyed by his program received no acknowledgement beyond sterile statistical entries. The fire started in the early hours of April 3, 1907, in the storage building adjacent to the main performance hall. By the time Columbus volunteer firefighters arrived, flames had spread to 3 structures, including portions of the residential buildings. The chaos of evacuation and firefighting created the first genuine breakdown in Gentry's absolute control since the compound's establishment. Performers fled burning buildings in nightclothes, many carrying children from the nursery as staff abandoned their posts. For the first time in years, they existed outside the compound's walls without escort or supervision. Local residents who had gathered to watch the firefighting efforts encountered performers they had only seen from audience seats, now standing in the street, displaced and vulnerable. Several performers made immediate decisions that would unravel Gentry's empire. Catherine Hollis, whose 2 daughters lived in the nursery, approached a family she recognized from Sunday services at Columbus Methodist Church. She asked if they would help her reach a sister in Bloomington. The family agreed. By dawn, Catherine and her daughters were on a train traveling south, the first successful escape from Gentry's program. Within 2 days, 5 more performers had fled. Some reached family members they hadn't contacted in years due to Gentry's mail censorship. Others sought help from Columbus residents who, confronted with direct testimony about conditions inside the compound, began questioning the benevolent narrative Gentry had maintained. The performers who escaped told stories of forced marriages, medical experimentation, children taken from parents, and absolute control that had stripped away their humanity. These testimonies reached the Indiana State Board of Charities within a week. Board investigators arrived in Columbus on April 15 to interview escaped performers and inspect the compound. What they found validated the testimonies: medical facilities containing equipment inappropriate for routine healthcare, locked rooms in residential buildings designed for confinement, financial record books showing Gentry's complete control over performer compensation, the nursery's daily logs documenting discipline methods that investigators recognized as systematic abuse. Gentry initially attempted to characterize the escapees as mentally unstable individuals spreading false accusations. He provided investigators with character assessments written by Fairchild, diagnosing several escaped performers with conditions that supposedly made them unreliable witnesses. The strategy might have succeeded if investigators hadn't discovered Gentry's own breeding record books, still intact despite the fire, containing documentation that corroborated everything the performers had described. The investigation expanded rapidly. Newspaper coverage brought additional scrutiny. The Indianapolis Star published interviews with escaped performers in late April. Public reaction shifted from curiosity to outrage as details emerged about the breeding program, forced marriages, and medical experimentation. Civic leaders who had praised Gentry's operation faced uncomfortable questions about how such systematic abuse had operated openly for over a decade. But Gentry had been preparing for potential legal consequences throughout his operation. He had structured his business affairs to shield personal assets, maintained relationships with influential attorneys, and documented everything in ways that could be interpreted as legitimate business practices if examined superficially. Most critically, he had already begun destroying evidence. The fire, investigators later suspected, had been deliberately set. Storage buildings that burned contained financial records and correspondence that would have provided the most damning evidence of Gentry's systematic planning. What survived was substantial but incomplete. Prosecutors reviewing the case found documentation of abuse but struggled to identify specific criminal charges that existing law adequately covered. Indiana had no statutes explicitly prohibiting genetic breeding programs. Medical experimentation wasn't regulated in ways that could be applied retroactively. Forced marriage arrangements, while morally reprehensible, didn't clearly violate laws as written in the early 1900s. Prosecutors could potentially charge assault for specific medical procedures or unlawful confinement for the locked room incidents. But Gentry's contracts and guardianship arrangements complicated these charges legally. By June, Gentry had sold the circus operation to a buyer from Ohio for a fraction of its value. He liquidated remaining assets, settled with several performers through confidential financial agreements that included non-disclosure provisions, and left Indiana. The State Board of Charities issued a critical report documenting systemic abuse, but criminal charges were never filed. Gentry disappeared into comfortable retirement, dying of natural causes in Chicago in 1909 without ever facing prosecution. Fairchild vanished from public record after 1908. His medical license had been issued in Indiana before standardized national certification existed, and he simply stopped practicing under his own name. Whether he continued experimenting under different circumstances remains unknown. The 1998 discovery revealed what the 1907 investigation had missed. Gentry's carefully maintained breeding records documented 43 children born under his program between 1896 and 1906. The State Board of Charities report had mentioned children living at the compound but never conducted comprehensive tracing of their fates. 91 years later, researchers attempted to answer the question. No one had asked in 1907 what happened to the children. 14 could be traced to families. These were children whose parents had escaped during the fire chaos and maintained custody despite having signed away legal guardianship rights. Several of these families changed their surnames and moved to different states, severing connections to their circus past. Census records, marriage certificates, and death records allowed researchers to follow these 14 lives forward. Most lived into adulthood. Some married and had children of their own, breaking the cycle of exploitation their parents had endured. The remaining 29 disappeared into gaps in the historical record that suggested deliberate erasure rather than simple documentation failure. Cross-referencing with institutional admission logs revealed partial answers. 8 children matching descriptions from Gentry's nursery photographs appeared in admission records at 4 different Indiana institutions between 1898 and 1906. They were listed with generic identifying information, approximate ages, physical characteristics, notation that they had been surrendered by guardians claiming inability to provide care. None of these institutional records listed parents' names or family background. None mentioned circus employment or the Columbus compound. The children simply appeared in ledgers as if they had materialized without history, admitted through processes that left no trail back to Gentry. His donations to these institutions had purchased not just admission without questions, but active cooperation in obscuring the children's origins. Institutional records showed some of these children lived for years in facilities designed for people deemed mentally or physically unfit for independent life. One boy admitted in 1900 age 4 remained institutionalized until his death in 1948 at age 52. He had spent 48 years confined because Gentry had rated him commercially unviable at age 3. His entire life had been determined by an evaluation system designed to assess entertainment value, not human potential. For 21 children, no records could be found at all. They appeared in Gentry's breeding record books with birth dates and initial assessment ratings, then vanished from documentation completely. Some may have died in infancy or early childhood, buried in unmarked graves or recorded under names that bore no connection to their documented nursery identities. Others may have been given to families through informal adoptions that left no legal record, a common practice in early 20th century child placement. The researchers who spent 18 months analyzing the recovered documents concluded their report with an acknowledgement of what couldn't be known. 21 children born into Gentry's breeding program disappeared so thoroughly that even their deaths couldn't be confirmed. They existed in photographs, in breeding record books, in nursery logs documenting their daily routines and developmental assessments. Then they simply ceased to exist in any traceable record. The Columbus Historical Society established a small exhibit about the compound in 1999. It included carefully selected documents illustrating the breeding program's systematic nature without displaying the most disturbing medical details or identifying living descendants. The exhibit attracted modest attention, mostly from scholars studying the history of disability rights and the evolution of legal protections for vulnerable populations. The warehouse building was demolished in 2001. The land was redeveloped as a small commercial plaza. No marker indicates what once occupied the site. Most Columbus residents born after 1950 have no knowledge that their community once hosted a compound where human beings were treated as breeding stock and children were evaluated for commercial potential before being discarded if they failed to meet entertainment value assessments. The last known survivor of Gentry's program died in 2012 at age 26. She had been born at the compound in 1906, just months before the fire. Her parents escaped with her during the chaos. She lived a full life, married, raised 4 children, and never spoke publicly about her origins until researchers contacted her in 2003. In her only recorded interview, she said she had always known she came from the circus compound, but had been raised to understand that some histories were better left unexamined. The documents remain archived at the Indiana Historical Society, available to researchers who request access. They stand as evidence that systematic dehumanization can operate openly in plain sight when society chooses not to look closely at what happens to people it considers different. If this story disturbed you, good. That discomfort means you still recognize evil when it's presented honestly. Hit that like button if you believe these stories need to be told, no matter how dark they get. Subscribe because there are dozens more cases like this one, hidden in archives, waiting for someone to care enough to uncover them. The algorithm buries content like this. Your engagement is the only thing that keeps these voices from being silenced twice. Don't let history forget what happened to people nobody thought worth protecting.